It's a story we've all heard before in one variation or another. The tale of the black sheep of the family. A beloved, legendary, top-selling, critical darling of a game is followed by an incredibly divisive sequel, one that takes things in a new and sometimes weirdly experimental direction. And the successor is a good or even great game when judged purely on its own merits. But it nevertheless proves controversial for being so different from the original, sparking a rallying cry among fans far and wide. The developer has lost their touch, gone too far, or is even worthy of the dreaded P-bomb, that most explosive epithet of artistic critique. They got all pretentious on us.
Find something to believe in, and find it for yourself. And when you do, pass it on to the future.
Believe in what?
That's your problem.
The overwhelmingly negative response forces the devs to backpedal from their grandiose and sky-high ambitions and come back down to earth. And so they course correct, figure out where they went quote-unquote wrong with the sequel, and then finally produce the incredible, once-in-a-generation masterpiece that we knew they were capable of all along. That is, once they stopped being so damn pretentious and got over their experimental phase.
Building the future and keeping the past alive are one and the same thing.
Yes, it is a tale that's about as old as the video game medium itself. The difficult, artistic sequel that inevitably follows the smash hit debut, as they say in the music business. And man, if you were to point to a single title that is widely considered to be gaming's poster child for the so-called sophomore slump, Castlevania II Simon's Quest is it. Double underlined, bolded, italicized, and word-arted. As the story goes, the action platforming masterminds at Konami had achieved a stroke of incredible genius with the first Castlevania, a game so tight in its focus and so purposeful in its design that it almost single-handedly forged entire new genres where none had existed previously. But then they mucked everything up with Castlevania II Simon's Quest, a sprawling and messy sequel that was some kind of confusing, open-ended RPG adventure hybrid type of game. And of course we all know what happened after that. Absolutely everyone hated it. Or at least, that's the story we are all told, which has become something of an article of faith among players thanks to an internet-driven Hivemind consensus.
This game sucks.
But what if I told you that the conventional wisdom around Simon's Quest isn't just wrong, it's nothing less than a mountain of unreconstructed slander, thoughtlessly and undeservedly heaped upon one of the best, most avant-garde, and most influential games of its era? That the reasons why Simon's Quest became so controversial had very little to do with the actual game itself. And that it is, in fact, the diametric opposite of a steaming pile of diarrhea dookie farts, like certain internet celebrity personalities may have led you to believe.
God, you still think you're funny? My father,
Dracula,
is a man of science, a philosopher, a scholar, and knows things our society have forgotten 3 times over. Do you still not understand the enormity of what we're doing?
Yes, it is time, past time even, to storm the vampire's castle, to crack open the coffin that contains one of gaming's hoariest relics of conventional wisdom, and to drag the ghoul inside kicking and screaming into the sunlight, dispelling its dread curse once and for all. What a horrible night for justice for Simon's Quest. Before we continue with the video, I want to highlight the sponsor of today's video. We live in an age of subscriptions. It is so draconian, if you ask me. There's barely any service these days that doesn't at some point change their model to, hey, you gotta subscribe and pay us monthly. Streaming services, video game services, VPNs, donations, patronage, software, heck, there's even sewing machines, washing machines, or goddamn garage doors that require you to pay a monthly subscription to friggin' use them. Or I was using a package of Premiere transitions that one day decided, nope, we're $12.99 a month from now. It's wild. Not to mention YouTube channels that start their own streaming services for $6 a month now. And why do they do that? Because it's easy for consumers to lose track of subscriptions, so you keep paying for stuff month by month and often don't even remember. Plus, if you do decide to cancel a subscription, it's more often than not made hard on purpose for you, so that you get discouraged from even dealing with it. It's a nightmare, honestly. and the running expenses keep piling up. This is where Rocket Money is a service I've really come to appreciate. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that, among other things, helps you actually keep track of your ongoing subscriptions, and often detects ones you might have completely forgotten about. And it cancels them for you, helping you get rid of that bureaucratic hassle once and for all. Now, a subscription service exclusively to cancel subscriptions would be a little ironic, right? But you can use Rocket Money for free, and it offers a lot more. For instance, Rocket Money can help you lower your bills by negotiating with companies like ISPs, cable, phone, electricity providers, and so on. Just upload a photo of your bill and Rocket Money will negotiate your bills for you and attempt to get you a better rate. And on top of that, offers a budgeting solution that helps you keep track of your finances in one convenient spot. It's used by over 5 million members and has helped customers save up to $750 a year with over 500 million in canceled subscriptions. If you'd like to give it a try, go to rocketmoney.com/RagnarRox or use the link in the description to get started for free. You can also unlock extra features with premium. That's rocketmoney.com/RagnarRox to get started for free. And with this, thanks a lot to our sponsor, and now I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Back in 1986, the first Castlevania burst into the scene on the Famicom disk system like a goddamn thunderbolt on a cloudless moonlit night. Here had arrived, seemingly fully formed and entirely out of nowhere, a template that would go on to define literally decades of action game design. The player's movement is slow, purposeful, and precise. There's no slippery motion inertia here as with contemporary platformers like Mario or Metroid. In Castlevania, every frame of the player's action must play in full before you can cue the next input, which means that when you walk or jump, you'll immediately get a sense for exactly how fast and far you can move. And the Castlevania secret sauce blend of ultra-challenging combat and platforming absolutely demands this degree of precision to the controls. And working hand in glove with the super precise movement is the built-in delay to the player's main method of attack, the iconic vampire killer whip. Your attacks don't register instantaneously as soon as you press the B button, but rather have extensive wind-up and follow-through states that are telegraphed via detailed and instantly legible character animations. The levels are exquisitely designed and multi-layered and packed with secret power-ups and deadly hazards. And this, combined with your limited health points and intricate movement and attack animations, all lends a very real sense of danger to the moment-to-moment gameplay. The player is made to feel like they've been thrust into a supremely tricky and perilous situation where they must make expert use of every scrap of hard-earned knowledge and muscle memory and every single tool in their arsenal to survive. Not to mention the head-bangingly incredible audiovisual presentation, which stands proudly alongside both the most outrageous fever dream rock operas and the grim darkness of death metal album covers imaginable. It all makes for a challenging, memorable, and singularly brutal play experience. And yet, it was rarely unfair to the player, but rather demanded that they fully internalize the game's lessons and logic and play by its very particular, clear-cut, and legible set of rules. A classic case of the whole package being even greater than the sum of its component parts, really. Now, a lot of these design elements will likely ring familiar to players of Souls-likes, survival horror games, character action titles, and similar. There's a good reason for that, and you really can't undersell this point. The OG Castlevania was so astonishingly innovative, it practically single-handedly laid the groundwork for whole entire genres that would arrive over the following decades. And that's not even mentioning the fact that Castlevania is one eponymous half of perhaps the most versatile, popular, and long-running subgenre this side of roguelike, the Metroidvania. So, Castlevania was a legendary legend of action platformers. But when it came time for a sequel, the crew at classic Konami weren't content to just pump out a bigger, badder, louder iteration, slap a 2 on the title and call it a day. The sequel to Castlevania would preserve all of the first game's main design elements and translate them into a vast, non-linear action-adventure RPG hybrid, complete with experience points and level-up mechanics, a fusion of genres that frankly didn't exist back in 1987 when the game first released in Japan as Dracula II Noroi no Fuyin. Where Castlevania I takes place against backdrops of mostly castles and caves, Castlevania II has an even grander and more epic scope that is immediately apparent. The player begins in a town, a safe zone, mostly. But then must venture out into the vast forested wilderness of Transylvania, where they'll scale perilous mountains and gorges, ford poisonous swamps, and plumb the shrouded cyclopean depths of the Hell House, among many other things. In Castlevania II, sub-weapons, puzzle artifacts, and whip power-ups are no longer one-off collectibles like they were in the first game that vanish from your character as soon as you die. They become a permanent and persistent part of the player's inventory, which can be called up at any time with the press of the start button. And of course, Castlevania II added a now legendary day-night cycle where after a set amount of time, the game world flips between daytime and nighttime states, with foes becoming both more numerous and much deadlier at dusk. In every way, this truly is Simon's quest, an epic journey of danger and intrigue, exploration and mystery, with the protagonist of the first Castlevania returning to settle the score with Dracula, and this time, it's personal. Now, if you're a devotee of modern classics like Blasphemous or Hollow Knight, you're probably saying to yourself right about now, a 2D action platformer with a heavy emphasis on exploration and RPG power progression? That sure sounds like a Metroidvania. And you'd be right about that. Though Symphony of the Night gets all the credits as the Vania progenitor of the Metroidvania appellation, it's really Castlevania II Simon's Quest that first gave us all of the main elements of this genre in their protean forms. Indeed, after Metroid and Anteriad, Castlevania II is the next game in the line of succession that can lay credible claim to the crown of the inaugural Metroidvania. The puzzle adventure mechanics, the open-ended exploration, the focus on RPG-style character growth, and slowly drip-fed increases to avatar strength, Castlevania II did it all, and did it before almost anyone else. Which means that, in a very real way, without Simon's Quest, there would never have been a Symphony of the Night, certainly not as we know it. And we'll get to that. Oh boy, will we get to that. Yes, Simon's Quest is indeed one of the most influential retro Metroidvanias, surpassing even iconic titles like Blaster Master. But if you listen to how the loudest voices in the room talk about the game these days, you'll walk away with a very different impression.
Simon's Quest is dumb, and it's stupid, and it's stupid, and it's dumb.
This is it. The game that put the angry video game nerd on the map and was the subject of Egoraptor's very first game design analysis video to boot. Yes, Simon's Quest is the game that spawned an entire generation of YouTube iterators and imitators who figured they too could try and make a career out of doing a Stedler and Waldorf routine over video game footage.
You now possess Dracula's rib. I wish I could possess a better game.
Simon's Quest maintains an influence that stretches far beyond the bounds of it being a relatively short piece of retro entertainment software. It has become a kind of meta-text in modern games discourse as one of the most hated and dunked on sequels ever released. One might even be so bold as to say that the age-old dunkery discourse on Simon's Quest is part of the ur-text of video essays on video games. No hyperbole or exaggeration here. Castlevania II may not be the quote-unquote best of the Retroidvanias. That R belongs to Rondo of Blood, of course, but it is for damn certain one of the most interesting and beguiling games in its series and of its era. And it's so much better than the internet consensus opinion would have you believe. Even by modern standards, this game still undoubtedly has its charms, and its weaknesses are vastly overstated. It carries forward the best elements of the first Castlevania, namely the engaging gameplay and the best-in-class presentation, while also innovating in what were remarkably forward-thinking ways. Not to mention how, even more so than the first game, Simon's Quest set the series' gold standard for absolutely rip-roaring killer soundtracks. The full OST is relatively short all told, but there's really not a dull tune or a single note out of place. There's a damn good reason why Bloody Tears is one of the most covered and remixed songs in all of video gamesdom. Nowadays, we tend to think of the Castlevania games as easily classifiable and set-in-stone things. There are the classic-style action platformers on 8 and 16-bit systems, There's the evolutionary leap of the RPG adventure Metroidvanias, which took root on the PS1 and fully blossomed on the Nintendo's handheld systems. And then there are the 3D action-adventure games on the N64 and PS2, PS3, which are generally considered the unloved, ugly ducklings of the Castlevania evolutionary lineage. But it's important to stress that this perspective is taking the long view of a series that's now nearly 4 decades old. During its heyday, Castlevania was something of an evolutionary miracle that was constantly experimenting, shape-shifting into new forms, and pushing whole genres forward along with it. And so it should be no surprise that Simon's Quest, as the first ever Castlevania sequel, did just that. Pioneering an almost entirely new and never-before-seen fusion of whip-cracking action, open-world exploration and adventure, and RPG-flavored power progression. Not just that, but so many elements of the series' narrative and lore that we think of as intrinsically Castlevania were first laid down in this game. This was the first game that fully explicated the Castlevania mythology, establishing the history of an eternal biblical struggle between Dracula and the Holy Belmont lineage, and the recurring cycles of the 100-year curse of the Demon Castle. With Simon's Quest, the battle against Dracula and his unhallowed hordes was no longer a one-and-done conflict. The stakes had been elevated to nothing short of an all-out holy war to save every soul in Christendom. This increased emphasis on narrative complements the game's massive expanded mechanical scope. The player is no longer gated by just platforming and combat challenges. Equal measures of exploration and puzzling are also required to progress. And this focus on exploration is only further complicated by the innovation of the day-night cycle, which drastically alters the feel of play by populating it with more and deadlier monsters once the terrible night arrives. This dynamic creates countless interesting challenges and meaningful choices for the player, the exact sort of dilemma-driven moment-to-moment gameplay that wouldn't feel amiss in a survival horror game. Do you press on and try to progress, even though you can sense that night will strike soon and your task will become that much more difficult? Or do you race to stay ahead of the sun and beat a retreat to the nearest church for some much-needed healing? Like the first Castlevania, enemies still drop collectible heart pieces that power your sub-weapons. But rather than serving solely as ammunition, hearts also function as experience points for the leveling system, and as a currency that can be spent in towns to upgrade your whip and buy new items, both of which are crucial to progression. Then there's the biggest challenge of all. Castlevania II trades out the straightforward and linear level design of the original for a sprawling and non-linear open world, the full breadth of which the player will crisscross multiple times during their journey. Simon will get plenty of opportunities to spend the hard currency he accrues while traversing Transylvania, and this is actually one of the more commonly cited points of contention around Simon's Quest, that the game requires the player to grind for upgrades.
So instantly this becomes farming, and instantly this becomes pointless and dumb. These kinds of things were meant to elongate a game. They're made to manipulate you into thinking you're achieving something more than you're actually achieving. What? Huh?
Sure, if you want to, you can totally play like you're in full retro RPG Dragon Quest mode. Just stick to the screen right outside of the starting town and grind out a conga line of basic foes until you've purchased every bit of gear in the shops, including that pricey Thorn Whip upgrade that costs a whopping 100 hearts. The whole process takes around, buckle up, a whopping 5 to 7 minutes, and I've timed it just to be sure. Truly an epic time waster of a grind. But here's the thing. If you skip the grinding and spend those same 5 to 7 minutes traveling east to the nearby town of Vera, you can buy the superior Chain Whip for 150 hearts, which makes the Thorn Whip obsolete. And odds are, the average player will have already collected most of the 150 hearts they'll need just by making the journey to Vera. This game really doesn't require you to grind at any point in your playthrough. It's crystal clear that the designers intentionally structured the power progression curve around the non-linear exploration and backtracking, with the player defeating enemies and earning hearts at a rapid clip. Rather, the drip-fed upgrades and inventory mechanics are a clever and supremely addicting way to add context, purpose, and focus to the player's journey, just like in modern Metroidvanias, or any good RPG really. But aside from that, the fact that the game does give the players the option to spend a tiny few minutes grinding for hearts in order to get equipment that'll make them stronger, an amount of time that's practically a fart in the wind compared to how much so many other beloved and acclaimed RPGs or other games, both modern and classic, such as Dragon Quests or Final Fantasies or a ton of games out there, require players to grind in order to even stand a chance. This option here in Simon's Quest makes the game more accessible to a wider range of players. It adds a means for players to lower the overall gameplay difficulty early on through a small effort of collecting currency for whom the whipping and platforming segments would otherwise be maybe too difficult. That's actually the reason why Warren Spector added stealth to Deus Ex, because he found the action segments too difficult. Just let that sink in. Hardcore skilled players can totally skip this and it's still perfectly manageable, albeit challenging, just like Castlevania 1, while less motorically skilled, patient or experienced players can work for a few minutes to make the game more manageable through perseverance instead of reaction skills. It's variable difficulty through intrinsic means the game provides without adding a distinct difficulty setting. This is the exact thing that, throw another coin in the jar, Dark Souls and successive FromSoft games are being praised to the high heavens for being the most ingenious game design invention since Snakes and Ladders. But when it comes to Simon's Quest, gamerdom's collective knowledge is that it is a bad game trademark because it features extremely subtle progression mechanics, because a handful of extremely impatient gamer influencers with a large following once screamed it from the rooftops. And beyond the change in level design from linear to open world, so many gameplay conventions from the first Castlevania are similarly transformed in Simon's Quest. Boss fights are only minimally challenging, up to and including Dracula himself, if you're equipped with the right sub-weapon for the job, that is. There is also no progress penalty for death either, besides losing all of your heart currency when you deplete your stock of 3 lives and arrive at the game over screen. Dungeons and other interiors often contain dead ends, as in actual momentum-shattering cul-de-sacs with no reward for the player or reason to exist otherwise, which is something you almost never see in games. I personally find it really charming, but I get why people hate it. Sometimes you just have to go a different way. Other times, an apparent dead end is actually an illusory wall that looks identical to all the other masonry but can be jumped right through or shattered with a well-placed flask of holy water. And at the risk of having to put yet another coin in the old Dark Souls comparison jar, it's true that an enterprising player with the proper know-how can speedrun to the end of Simon's Quest and turn the game inside out in a space of well under an hour. Which, to be totally fair, is also true of the first game, or many NES games for that matter. You don't even need to be a speedrunner to demolish the first Castlevania in around half an hour if you know what's going on in the game. But speed and power aren't the point of Simon's Quest at all. Earning the knowledge of how to finish is where the real challenge lies, and it's the entire point of the game. Taking the time to converse with the local townsfolk and collecting the hidden clue books is just as crucial as your skills with cracking the whip and slinging vials of holy water. And keep in mind, this was the late 80s, so there was no such thing as an in-game quest journal for a game like this. It was absolutely required for the player to pay attention, have a notepad and pencil at hand to jot down all the important hints and signpostings you'll find scattered across the realm. Indeed, this all-encompassing vibe of mystery and exploration is the defining aspect of Simon's Quest's experience. But more than that, Castlevania II isn't just an evolution of its immediate predecessors. It's also a total subversion of the genre-defining action game fundamentals that the first Castlevania had pioneered, which is about as risky a bet as one could imagine for a sequel to an ultra-popular million-selling game. And the fact that this was all done on the lowly Famicom NES in a way that was really only matched by Metroid as far as contemporaries go, releasing just 1 year after the first Castlevania, and for a game that is the total opposite of a hyper-iterative playing-it-safe sequel, the fact that Simon's Quest exists at all is something of a minor miracle. In so many ways, this is the absolute definition of a game that simply couldn't get made today. Simon's Quest is a bigger, bolder, and even more inventive spin on the formula of the original Castlevania. More environments, more enemies, more gameplay systems and mechanics, more of everything. And Simon's Quest has plenty on offer for story and lore-minded players as well, to complement this newfound focus on exploration and adventure. This is the very first game that fully establishes the canon of the Belmont lineage and the deadly curse of Dracula and his demon castle that recurs throughout the Castlevania series. As Castlevania II makes clear from the opening blurb in the manual and various conversations with the downtrodden Transylvanian peasantry, Dracula isn't just a singular demonic entity that can be contained by a one-off showdown. He's a literal goddamn force of nature, an evil supernatural demigod who desecrates and defiles the countryside and its denizens even as he lies dead in a shallow grave. Some of the townsfolk even go so far as to blame Simon's defeat of Dracula in the first game for their current misery, and fear that your quest will once again do them more harm than good. Even in defeat, the evil of Dracula warps and corrupts everything it touches, including our titular, peerless protagonist. Despite besting old Drac in the first Vania, Simon is afflicted by a degenerative curse that will claim his life unless he can figure out a way to undo Dracula's evil magics. Thus, the name of the game. Vad the motherfucking Impaler is back, bitches, and the only way to re-undead him again is to drive an oak stake through each mystic orb that protects the scattered parts of his corpse and gather them to complete a dispelling ritual that will seal away Dracula and his curse for good. Simon, too, is back, and he's a changed man. He swapped out his orange duds from the first game for a more striking red and black look, aka the hues of blood and darkness. And the upgrades aren't just visual, but mechanical as well. As I mentioned before, unlike in the first game, sub-items and whip power-ups stay with you even when you die, and the level-ups earned from collecting XP permanently increase your health and damage resistance. Everything about this game is designed to give the player the sense of being on an epic journey that picks up right where the first game left off. And it does a wonderful job of realizing this tone while working within the harsh limitations of its native hardware. But all of this can't help but beg the question, why then did this game become the go-to whipping boy for every shitty listicle out there about sequels that totally suck compared to the first game in the series? Much of this is simply down to the power of crowds. It's an object lesson in both the power and the danger of the authoritative video essay tone. A lot of people heard AVGN and Egoraptor express these ideas confidently and commandingly, and so a lot of people started believing what they were saying was true, effectively memeing these ideas into existence as a new kind of common knowledge.
This game sucks.
And the more people that believed, the more powerful and true it became, regardless of whether or not these ideas have any basis in actual reality.
Kinda like that killer clown from that one Stephen King book where the kids decide to have an orgy to cement their friendship.
And that's not even getting into the fact that the AVGN's shtick was intended to be an over-the-top parody of gamer stereotypes. That was then monkey see, monkey do by a generation of irate gamers who took the whole thing 100% seriously and at face value, and went on to endlessly regurgitate it into a gigantic human video game dunkery centipede.
The scourge of the universe.
Now, I'm not in the business of doing those tedious response and rebuttal videos where I pull each point out of its original context and do a line-by-line debate nerd dissertation for every single thing I disagree with. And just to be even more crystal clear about my intentions here, I massively respect Egoraptor and the AVGN for the trail they blazed for YouTube video essays. All of us are building on the works of those who came before us, and I'm no exception to that. Plus, I freely admit that it's easy for me to make the criticism in hindsight, because when their videos on Simon's Quest first came out, I was right there with everyone else, laughing along as they dumped all over this game. And even I felt extremely compelled by their arguments for a while, so much so that I actually thought for a while, no, yeah, you're right, this game actually does suck. Even though I remember vividly loving my time with it back in elementary and early middle school, when me and my friends couldn't wait to share our newest findings the next day in the schoolyard and puzzle it out together like a grand, mysterious quest we were on. But then some 15-20 years later, I find myself listening to some video essayists convincingly hammering in their opinions with well-structured audiovisual theses, and suddenly I'm convinced, nah, yeah, right, the video essayist is right about how I feel about it. I always thought this game sucked. The stuff's insidious, man.
You are not immune to propaganda.
But it is exactly because I respect AVGN and Egoraptor so much that I feel compelled to set the record straight, if only for myself. Because they're both dead wrong on this one. And beyond just being wrong on the individual merits of the game, in the process they've inadvertently done immense long-term reputational damage to a game that just plain doesn't deserve to be on the receiving end of this much flack. Some of their points of criticism can be dismissed out of hand, like Eoraptor's complained over the color palette change for Simon in Castlevania II. Sure, yeah, when you're standing in the starting town with its red brick background, Simon's red outfit doesn't immediately pop as much as the orange-blue complementary colors of the original Castlevania's strongest scenes. But once you step outside the town, what to your wondering eyes should appear but a sea of verdant greenery? And wouldn't you know, Simon's new red duds are a perfect complementary color for all those green trees in the backdrop of the wilderness, which is where you'll spend so much of your playtime, and where you're met with foes as opposed to the town environment. You know, where it counts to have good spatial awareness. There can also be enemies in towns, but that's at night when the color palette switches to dark blue in the background and Simon pops when you need it. It should go without saying that it is absurdly easy to cherry-pick your points like this and frame them in an unfairly negative light to get your opinion across, and the audience at large just passively gobbles it up. This type of selective criticism could just as easily be done in reverso, to praise Simon's Quest as the far superior title over Castlevania I. Let's see here. See, in Castlevania I, the entire second level has a red brick backdrop, and boy does it make Simon's red-orange color palette look like total ass. Orange on red? Ever heard of color theory, game designers? What a crappy design choice for literally the longest level in the game. This art design is a mess. And meanwhile, look at how amazingly incredible Simon's Quest looks against this, as you bask in the full beauty of nature with its lush and verdant greens, with Simon's red outfit contrasting perfectly against the background. Now that's peak visual design with intentionality. Wham blam, thank you ma'am. See, it's not exactly the fairest appraisal. These kinds of things are just pretty much unavoidable when you have to choose from a palette of 55 colors, of which you can only display 13 on screen at a time if you want your stages to be varied in style and feel across the length of the whole game. So the truth is really somewhere in between. Both games have areas that absolutely smash, while others are rather an eyesore. Simple as that. But the strongest points of critique and complaint against Castlevania II revolve around two interrelated things: the puzzles and the game's terrible translation localization. The colored crystals are probably the most infamous and readily cited example of where the English translation of this game fell on its face. You buy the white crystal in Jova, then when you take it to the one guy in the town of Algira, he trades you for the blue crystal. Talk to the other guy in the corner of Aldra and he'll swap it for the red crystal. Only now what? Oh right, good thing we were taking notes, because that clue book in Brahms' mansion told us to wait for a soul with a red crystal on Deborah Cliff, which is supposed to be a hint telling the player to walk up to the westernmost wall of the Deborah Cliff area, equip the red crystal in your inventory, and then kneel for a few seconds before a divine wind comes and sweeps you onward. Blah? Yeah, Simon's Quest is squarely what us old-timers used to call a Nintendo Power game, which means that unless you wanted to spend quite a few extra hours figuring things out on your own, a walkthrough from the pages of Nintendo Power magazine was the quickest way to learn exactly what you needed to do to overcome the game's most devious puzzles. This was, after all, the pre-internet era, when the lunch table rumor mill was the source of all the hottest gaming news and strategies. Though a lot of it turned out to be BS made up by that one kid who said he had an uncle who worked at Nintendo. It's not exactly a coincidence that when Simon's Quest first came out in the US, the walkthrough was front-page material for that month's issue of Nintendo Power. And I can just say, goddamn, that the decapitated Dracula head on the cover gave me nightmares when I first saw it as an impressionable wee lad. But just to complicate things even further, some of the in-game hints you'll receive in Simon's Quest are downright nonsensical, or even worse, they're straight up lies. Hit Deborah Cliff with your head to make a hole. The flame is on top of the 6th tree in Dennis Woods. Nonsense and balderdash, all of it. The Japanese to English translation of Simon's Quest, to put it charitably, ranges in quality from mystifying but still legible, all the way down to totally busted and garbled with obvious misspellings. Now look, it's become something of a hot topic these days to bash on translators and localizers for deviating from the source material, and I want to make clear that this is very much not what this is about. Most of the development of Simon's Quest is lost to the mists of retro history, but where Konami didn't, the fandom has stepped in to plug our knowledge gaps. The ROM hacker Biscuit has done a magnificent line-by-line breakdown comparing the retail English translation of Simon's Quest with the original Japanese, alongside a proper retranslation that accurately conveys the meaning and intent. And based on my review of Biscuit's stellar translation work, I'd say it's highly probable that the original translators didn't do a bad job per se, certainly not through total carelessness or lack of giving a fuck. Many of these errors can be explained by the fact that they likely were faced with the classic video game translator's conundrum of having all of the game's Japanese script dumped context-free into one giant spreadsheet with no reference for the visuals the players would be seeing on screen when they read the corresponding text. And so the translators just had to start plugging away as best they could, working on a tight schedule and even tighter budget. In game dev, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by poor project management. So to illustrate why playing Simon's Quest with a proper translation makes all the difference in the world, let's take that example of the Red Crystal and Deborah Cliff. This part is infamous for roadblocking players thanks to the supremely unhelpful hint, and it's easy to see why. Wait for a soul with a red crystal on Deborah Cliff. How do I wait exactly, and for how long? And do I need to have the red crystal, or is this soul going to bring the red crystal to me? And most importantly, nowhere does it explain that Simon needs to kneel in order to summon the requisite teleportation tornado.
Penitent man will pass. Penitent man.
But now, let's compare that to a proper, contextually sensitive translation of the original Japanese with a tip of the hat to Biscuit. Press a ruby against Deborah Cliff, kneel and wait for a whirlwind. Bada bing, bada boom, gabagool. This is about as clear and straightforward a hint as you could ask for. You need to have the red crystal equipped by Deborah Cliff, and you need to be kneeling in order to progress.
Penitent man is humble. Kneels before God.
So yes, the poor English translation goes a long way towards explaining how this game is regarded outside of Japan. But it's also not completely fair to heap all the blame upon the translators. Because as it turns out, a lot of the hints and NPC dialogues in the Japanese original were also similarly dubious, unhelpful, and essentially designed to mislead the player. Even with the proper translation, the game is still trying to misdirect and confound you every step of the way. That whole thing about hitting Deborah Cliff with your head to open a hole, that is there in the Japanese version too. And that mysterious woman who is kinda maybe hitting on you when she tells you to go wait by the river at midnight only to totally stand you up, she does the same thing in Japanese.
Simon's Quest? More like Simon's Friend Zone. Wokeness strikes again.
It sounds quite unfriendly and even a little cruel to the player, and it absolutely is. But again, this is a game where the experience isn't chiefly about a straight path towards becoming an overpowered badass and moving down swaths of foes with your mighty flaming whip, although you will get to do plenty of that too. No, the whole point of this game is to instill in the player the sense, the experience of being on an epic adventure of mystery, exploration, and discovery. The game's progression is meant to be not straightforward. And the true challenge isn't the platforming or the combat, but rather in the quest to acquire the knowledge needed to triumph over Dracula and the forces of darkness. For how totally dunked on Castlevania II is these days, you'd be forgiven for not knowing that the initial reaction to Simon's Quest was actually quite positive. The game sold very well and received solid reviews both in its native Japan and around the world.
Yep, that's exactly why I keep putting an asterisk in the title of my Castlevania videos.
But even more important to the larger conversation, according to a US Gamer interview with Castlevania creative head honcho Koji Igarashi, the warm contemporary response and critical praise for Simon's Quest was exactly what prompted Konami to press forward on development of the legendary Symphony of the Night, with Daddy Iga himself at the helm.
Simon's Quest actually played a very important role for Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Before Simon's Quest, games didn't delve as much into RPG elements like exploration. Simon's Quest had that foundation of exploration. It was easier for us to let the higher-ups know Castlevania works with exploration, and that we wanted to put more of that into Symphony of the Night. Castlevania fans have very strong opinions. Around the time we created Symphony of the Night, there were a lot of fans of the older games who were opposed to it. But because there was Simon's Quest, it was a lot easier to change things around.
Again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Without Simon's Quest first laying the groundwork for the Metroidvania template, Symphony of the Night may very well have never come to fruition. Or if it did, it would have been a radically different game than the one we got. And as much as the English localization of Simon's Quest is undoubtedly a shoddy affair, it also in no way detracts from the game's appeal. If anything, I think many longtime fans would tell you that the busted translation adds a certain je ne sais quoi in furtherance of the game's mysterious atmosphere. For the player who goes into things with the right mindset, that is. Castlevania II is a case study in something I've been going on about for years now. The importance of judging games by how successful they are at what they set out to accomplish, on their own merits and in their own historical context, rather than how they score when measured against the accepted modern game design best practices of the current moment. If you go into Simon's Quest with the mindset that the game is out to intentionally frustrate you and quote-unquote waste your time because you think you know how the designers could have done a better job, well then you're gonna walk away from the experience with an opinion closer to Egoraptor and AVGN. And hey, that's fine, to each their own. But if you take Simon's Quest at face value, engage it on its terms with just a little bit of patience and an open mind, you're in for nothing short of an adventure of a lifetime. That is why a game like Simon's Quest lingers in your memory, even decades down the line, and why players who were around when it was still new have formed such powerful personal attachments to their experiences with it. Because once you figure out that you need to kneel in front of Deborah Cliff with the red crystal equipped for a couple of seconds before the whirlwind appears, but every damn time you do it, it takes just long enough that you still wonder if you're doing it correctly, this is the kind of unforgettable feeling that will stick with you for the rest of your days. But hey, thanks to the magic of modern ROM hacking and emulation, almost all of the usual criticisms have basically become non-issues. There are several sparkling retranslations of this game available as fan patches in English and various other languages like Spanish, Finnish, Tagalog, and Indonesian, the most famous of which is Simon's redaction by the almighty Guru, which was the very first attempt at doing a proper English language revision that cleans up the translation errors, while also adding some minor quality of life adjustments like making the text display much more quickly and smoothly. But personally, whether you're a total newbie or a Vania veteran, I'd recommend taking a page from the Book of Biscuit and using their incredible English translation patch. This not only fixes up the translation and text speed, but also includes some absolutely killer extras, like replacing the password system with SRAM saves and an in-game map that matches the one included in the Japanese instruction manual, which was excised from the game's worldwide release. Having this map available in-game at the press of a button makes an enormous difference, to the point where I'd bet that, had it been included in the instruction manual with the original English release, there wouldn't have been nearly as much cries of, "Where the hell do I go?" And look, as much as I absolutely condone and even encourage hoisting the Jolly Roger whenever the mood strikes you, you can absolutely do this 100% above board too, if you'll forgive the mixed naval metaphors. The Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which contains Simon's Quest, regularly goes for a pittance on sale on PC, and it's supremely easy peasy to extract your own personal copy of the game ROMs from the installation. From there, it's just a short whip and a jump over to romhacking.net. You can use their handy browser-based patcher to apply your preferred retranslation to Simon's Quest. All the links are in the description, by the way. And also, by the way, apropos of nothing and everything, can I go off for a second about the term Metroidvania? Like, I love the genre and all its derivatives with a passion, but what an ugly fucking portmanteau this is. Almost as bad as Soul's Kiro Ringborn-like, or whatever the heck they're calling him these days. Now, I'm not going to act like I'm the first person to say this, not by a long shot. Many people have been complaining for years about Metroidvania's unwieldiness as a genre moniker, to the point where I still see critics trying to offer up even more dopey and heavy-handed terms as a replacement, like gated progression, guided nonlinearity, or utility-based exploration. Hogwash, I say, because as luck would have it, the Japanese have already come up with a far more elegant term for this game genre, one that dates back almost as far as Simon's Quest itself. Search action. It's perfection. All the facets of the experience, combat, adventure, discovery, contained within 3 short, punchy, and elegant syllables. And the search in search action is really the seminal part of it, isn't it? Because Simon's Quest is ultimately a game where misdirection, dead ends, false starts, and anticlimaxes are purposefully and intentionally a central part of the play experience. Which is something that video games just plain aren't supposed to do. That's bad game design. What were they thinking? Simon's Quest is perhaps the ultimate 7 out of 10 experience, aka the highest possible accolade for a game in my books and the grandest of superlatives. It's not perfect, but it is for damn certain interesting. And it accomplished things that few other contemporary games had even tried, even if the execution wasn't 100% flawless. Big whoop. At the risk of recapitulating what I already said in my Castlevania 64 video, I'll take a spiky but interesting 7 out of 10 game over a homogenized, watered-down, pre-pureed and pre-digested 10 out of 10 blockbuster where all the edges are smoothly sanded off any day of the week. Wham bam, thank you ma'am. And thus, our duology ends here. The closing chapter of Retroidvania II Ragnar's Quest from Castlevania 64 to Simon's Quest. Two of the most interesting and influential games of all time that somehow had also been memed into becoming two of the most hated on video game sequels ever made. Castlevania truly is a series of superlatives and extremes in every sense. But if you take away any single lesson from our video essay journey across these two titles, let it be this. Perfection is an impossible dream for any form of art, but especially for games. Sacrifices and compromises will always have to be made, and great ideas will always get left on the cutting room floor in order to meet the demands of the market and get the game into the player's hands. It's just how it is, and always will be. Simon's Quest stands out as a testament to the fact that it's precisely the most unpolished edges of a game that can make the experience all the more enticing, memorable, and meaningful for the player. As the famous Brian Eno quote goes, the sound of failure can often be the sweetest melody because so much modern art is the sound of things going out of control, of a medium pushing to its limits and breaking apart. So remember, no matter what all the rage critics might tell you, the power and influence of Simon's Quest will outlive us all. Guaranteed. Because as long as Dracula's curse still lurks in the hearts of men, nothing can keep a good vamp down. I'd honestly love to hear your personal thoughts and feelings on Castlevania II Simon's Quest. Did you ever play the game? Did you play it back when it came out? Or later? Pre-Egoraptor AVGN slander or post? Did you enjoy it, loathe it, or maybe you were just lukewarm about it? Let me know, I really want to hear it, because that's the thing. Each one's personal experience on the game is completely valid, as long as you don't take your opinion on it as gospel and attack others for differing on it. You can apply that to virtually any video game, actually. A maxim to live by. Now, hey, thank you for watching. If this was your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on my channel I largely cover old games, horror games, indie games, and combinations thereof. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to check out my pre-sequel to this video, Why Everyone, Asterisk, was wrong about Castlevania 64. I've been doing YouTube video essays for almost 10 years now, wild, and my channel over the years has found its focus area where I feel really happy and content in. As I mentioned, long-form, high-effort, retrospective/review type video essays on old horror, indie games, but for the past few months I've been starting a very low-key series of videos that are an extremely enjoyable outlet for me to cover content that I used to do more back in the day when I would just cover anything that came to mind without a real structure behind it. It's low production time videos that I can make in about a day, and it can be about anything. A commentary on something that's just on my mind, a let's play, or in the case of the latest one, an actual Forgotten Gems light episode. See, I used to do a series on my channel called Forgotten Gems, in which I covered old games that had in some ways fallen into obscurity. I really loved that series, it was so dear to my heart, but it kept performing so poorly that I eventually put it on indefinite hiatus. And it was a good decision for the channel overall, even though I miss it. But there was one big thorn in my side all this time. The last official video in that series was on the lovely 90s point-and-click adventure game Orion Burger. And in that video, I announced that the next video in the Forgotten Gems series would be the other one of the two games that studio that made Orion Burger, namely Sanctuary Woods, had ever released before they closed doors, namely The Riddle of Master Lu. But that video never happened, and that was now almost 5 years ago. It kept sitting with me, but with this backer-exclusive series that I talked about, that I called RagnarRambles, my patrons actually voted for me to right that wrong. So on my Patreon, I recently released a very informal review of this game, very much from the top of my head and very much from the heart, because I do love that game, and it was a blast talking about it. So if that's interesting to you, or if you just want to help the channel out with a monthly donation within your comfort levels, Patreon is the ideal way to go. Thank you so much for considering. The support of my patrons over the years has literally been the backbone that made this entire channel possible and made it possible to stay afloat for all this time. You guys have my sincere gratitude. And now, as always, I'm always looking forward to this part at this point. It's always become a soothing ritual for me. My special shout out to these top tier supporters: LSN HNG, Vincent Kavanaugh, Aurora Milpomene Crescendo, Sean H, 9ball9606, Gehennas, Telebin, Giselle, Sam Laurel, Ronan Crom aka Daniel 242172, Shannon Blue, Uziel 1447, John Boring, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Laird Wakala, Vasily Prokhorov, Isabella Stoner, Casper Ram, Morgan K, Thomas Bona, Hippo Hobbly, Swiss Hackmod, Ari Orison, Corey Marr, Amber Wiggins, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Sumatul, Christy, Jin Hansen, Angelo Benedetti, Adrian Kubiak, Matt Gretton, Zodi, Thwagam, Nikot the Brave, Cannon Ward, Terraflops, Link Hughes, Kerry George, Chuck Taylor, Sonny Sky, The Spiral Architect, Billy Lott, David Zelenak, Kyle Lee, Catherine Escobar, Dana Rosa, Tabby, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Felix, Felix D, Nathan Gillick, Leyland B, and Sable Cowell. Until next time, ta-ta.